Well, joining me now, we did a home and away. I think is the way to do it. It's Mike Pesca, who, of course, is best known as host of The Gist. I think of you, Mike, as sort of a podcast pioneer. Do you feel like you're a pioneer of this day and age? I mean, you've been doing this for more than a decade. Who else can
Yes.
say that?
Many can. They'd be lying. I do think it's the longest running
I guess
news and
Simmons,
analysis.
you and Bill
podcast.
Simmons, right? Like, or feel
Right,
like the
right.
longest
If it's
podcasters.
newsy, Terry Gross has had a podcast version of Fresh Air longer than I have. So if you take all the radio shows that went into had a podcast version in 2007 or 8, sure. But doing it as a daily show, news analysis, I think it's me. If not, I'll take on all comers in the next daily show, since there is always a daily show.
Well, look, whether you're one of the pioneers, right? Let's put it in those terms. I think we'd all accept that. I think it's fascinating. I just had this conversation with a media reporter who was asking me, what do I make of podcasts shifting to video? And, and I said, look, I'll be honest, 6 months ago, I still would have argued against video for podcasts, because what I like the best about a podcast is eavesdropping on a conversation. And the idea, and I'm a believer that once you introduce a camera, I'm going to get a less honest take. I'm going to get a less honest version of that person. But that isn't where the world is headed. And in fact, you will not have a successful podcast if you stick to audio only now. It just is what the business is. But when did this transition take place, and where are you on it? I mean, obviously you've embraced it. Was it a reluctant embrace or an enthusiastic one?
Yeah, I hate it. I got to be honest. My friend PJ Vogt has a great podcast, and he doesn't want to do video because he says he wants to do the best version of what he's doing. And the best version of what he does, Search Engine, which is a nonfiction podcast, would be a documentary. And documentaries are their own skill set. So he's either doing the very best audio podcast or a third-rate documentary. I feel like I'm doing the best podcast that I could possibly do, or a TV talk show with a weird green curtain behind me. The curtain's going to get better, at some point. I swear to God. So I also think, was this what it seems like? It's what the audience demanded. If you look at audience metrics, right? Videos are doing really well. And if you look at people under 32, they don't think of podcasting as an audio medium. They think of it as a video medium. But so often it is the algorithms, or it is some corporate boss that made a decision. And what really is going on is that Spotify has decreed that this is the way to go, because they're thinking of ways
put this
to
on
differentiate
on Spotify, not YouTube. That's interesting.
Yes. Yeah, YouTube is benefiting from it, but mostly it's Spotify saying video. There's one other aspect I'll get into, but Spotify has said to themselves, if we become a video player, that's much better for business, because as an audio player, we're not differentiated from the Apple podcast or some of the other audio podcasts out there, but we've got video from the jump. So some of the most popular ones, like Joe Rogan, they've always been video. So then they started to tell everyone, you got to go video. I think they probably punish people who didn't go video. The other thing that's going on is podcast has a terrible problem with discovery, right? The funnel is, if you get attention, maybe you got attention, you left NBC, people said, where's Chuck? And early on, people started to find you. And to this day, people are probably saying, oh, Chuck's there on podcasting.
Right.
The funnel in almost only works in the beginning. And then a year in, 2 years in, how do you get attention? It's terrible. There's no way in podcasting to kind of tell people that you're out there, but video is the one way to do it. So you have clips. I only do video. I do a video of every interview I do. I think we'll put this up on video, and some people will watch it. The only reason I'm doing that is to generate clips from Instagram, so that maybe someone will see this Instagram clip and say, oh, Mike Pesca, Chuck Todd, that exists as what I consider to be the primary product, which is audio. It's crazy, and it's algorithm driven.
It's so true. And what you just described, and I appreciate you describing it that way, because it is, there's weird something in human nature. For whatever reason, we won't clip on an audio clip.
Hmm.
You send a great exchange between you and I, audio only, and it doesn't get, whether it's on a social media app or it's via text or whatever. I'm this way. Like, send me a piece of video, I quickly watch it. Send me a piece of audio, I'm like, well, let me put my headphones in or whatever. Whatever it is. And so it feels as if almost 90% of the reasons most podcasts went video is, well, it's the only way to market the podcast.
Yeah, I think it has fundamentally to do with attention. So when something has a visual component, including words, it's
Mm-hmm.
vying for your attention. It's announcing itself. It's saying, pay attention
Yep.
to me, probably because of the kind of animals we were on the savannah as prey. By the way, anthropology is finding out more and more that we're inherently prey, and most of our motivation is we're worried about being
Survival.
harmed. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. So we're
Yep.
so we're animals, we're worried about this. And the visual is how we stay alive. The
Yep.
audio is a little bit deeper. It probably activates other aspects of our brain, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not as urgent. Visual is urgent, audio less urgent. This
Mm-hmm.
used to be great. The lack of urgency in audio, when I worked for NPR for 10 years, we
Oh,
would use phrases like, it's a companion and it's and we'd have driveway moments, but it was sort of the warm bath of attention as opposed to
yes.
a tiger's going to eat us of attention.
Well,
So I do think that there's fundamental difference between each medium. And I
yep.
think that it's have people really said, why I like audio video podcasts? I just like them. They just appeal to me. I don't know how many people have said that. Maybe young people have said that, but I think you can't get away from it. And in this attention economy is also the urgency
Right.
economy. Yeah.
Right. Um, Here's something else, though, that why I think many people wouldn't have predicted that podcasts would continue to grow. And in some ways, this is right. We're in a second growth period because of the video component. I guess it's probably the best way to put it. But um, and maybe this is going to change as more people do live. But I think about you doing a daily podcast. How did you get over the moment that you finished your recording and then some breaking news happened and you're like, oh man, this is going to feel, because you have to get over that, because I could make a
Yeah.
case that you can always find a story. Oh, I wish we would have done this. You can always find
Yes.
a reason to be. How did you get over that? And does it surprise you that the public hasn't punished the podcast industry collectively for its ability not to be in real time? Because it's really not in real time. I always say a good podcast is on the news, not necessarily, it's news adjacent,
Yeah.
sometimes can feel on the news, but it's not necessarily in a breaking news moment.
Well, it's a problem. And I don't know if it's gotten, you're framing the question. Look how much podcasting has thrived, even though this is the case. I think it's thrived despite that. I think if there was a way to be on the news, it would be even better. And it's especially true when news happens on a Sunday. And I listen to a lot of sports podcasts. And if the
Mm-hmm.
game was on a Saturday and the production schedule is not to come back to a Monday, I have to wait 2 days to get my podcast discussion of the game. I do not like that. So I think that it is a problem. How would I get over it? Just when it became apparent that I was killing my staff the first three times,
Right.
I said, we
Yes.
got to go live. And it didn't,
Yeah.
it didn't really matter. But here's what's happening. We are in an age of media abundance, but it's really
Mm-hmm.
commentary. There's so much more commentary than news, and even so much of the news is commentary, as you
Yeah.
know. And I don't
Yeah.
know how much the consumer really realizes that, but I think we've gotten to a ratio that's, I don't know if it's dangerous, but it's certainly not
Well,
optimal. And
this is my,
podcasts
yeah.
are more commentary than is, I think, optimal.
No, it is. And it's, I get so frustrated when people are even trying to pay me a compliment, but they'll say, oh, I can tell you're really speaking your mind. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't mean I'm a partisan. I'm just sort of,
Yeah.
I'm no longer what I always say is I'm no longer rounding the edges as much, right? For network television, I'd have to round the edges. Sometimes it's because my first name was Meat, or sometimes because I knew whatever I said was going to reflect all on the entire network, fair or unfair, that it would. And I was mindful of that. I always got irritated when certain colleagues who hosted certain cable news morning shows didn't seem to care about their colleagues and the perception that they were creating for the rest of us that have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm no longer rounding the edges, right? I'm like, yeah, Joe Scarborough is the singular. If you're looking for somebody who did the most damage to the press and the Joe Biden story, it's Joe Scarborough. Now, it just is.
Maybe that was
You
his
know,
long game as a Republican.
I don't know, but it's like I don't know
No,
how
no.
else to put it, right? He was now
Mhm,
what
mhm.
I always found unfair is that was just his opinion, and it should have just been seen as like I don't mind that he did that. That
Yeah.
was an opinionated show. What I minded was the perception that somehow this was a media driven narrative, and it's like no, he's a partisan, but all of that has gotten so lost. I mean, me trying to explain that that hey, Morning Joe is not this. It's not a news. It's more of a commentary thing. And, it's at this point, what does the viewer see? As I've always said, that Peacock is on every channel. So the viewer just sees it all as one thing. They don't differentiate it that much. It's true of
Right.
newspaper headlines, whether the headline's over an op-ed or a news story, the headline's the headline, and it's a Washington Post headline, right? Regardless of which section
Yeah.
of the paper. So it is, I don't know whether it's even worth fighting those particulars anymore in the news consumption space.
The last 100 people who pointed out to me, well, that's an opinion piece, not from the news section, were all journalists. No citizen has ever
Yeah.
said that to me. But was that a news piece? Just the other day on the show, I did a big story on a Guardian piece trying to say that the defund movement worked well in Houston and Seattle. And it clearly didn't if you look at the murder rate.
Mhm.
And I was like, wait a minute, is this a news piece? And I scanned it and I actually put it through GPT. Is this a news piece or is this an opinion piece? And it was in the news section. And then we figured out it probably shouldn't have been. But no, you're so right that no one gets the distinction.
Right.
And there's one of the reasons they don't get the distinction isn't just on the consumer. Certain outlets will sometimes cordon off news and opinion, but there are almost no outlets anymore that you would be shocked that that opinion is being run in that outlet. There's
Yeah.
almost no outlets where you'd even be a little bit surprised. I think the Atlantic will consistently, if we strip the title and I said, where did this run? You might consistently say that could either be in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. So that's a little bit unique. But especially before Jeff
Mhm.
Bezos had this turn with the Washington Post where
Oh,
he
I
didn't,
know. I used
it
to
was,
think the Post was the best of all worlds for a while. I really did. I
yes,
felt like for a
yes.
period
And
of
then,
time, the Post was its best version of itself. And then Jeff
right,
Bezos
because
got
I
too
think they
involved.
were reflecting Washington. And Washington was a
Yeah.
town with functional Democrats and Republicans, and they would sometimes talk to each other. But when that got to
Mhm.
change, the Post got to change. And now there are many, many stories that were in the Post opinion section that were you wouldn't say, oh, that could run in another
Mhm.
newspaper's opinion section who had a reading of Donald Trump that wasn't caustic. So yeah, I think it's I think it's very one of the very bad trends of journalism.
It
Also,
is.
could I just say, when you say I've heard you say that before, my first name is Meat, as in the press.
Yeah.
How many people, and did you guys have a supercut in the studio where people called you Todd by mistake?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
that
That's
happened like
super.
once every 4 shows.
It did. What's funny about it for me is that actually I grew up with that because my grandfather, his first name was Merle and his middle name was Lynn. So what do you think he preferred to be called? Todd. Okay. So he actually all of his friends called him Todd. My
Yeah.
father had it literally his associates would call him Todd. My mother, when she got into real estate, she would be just referred to as Todd. It's such a normal thing in my family that it's funny you bring it up. It always seemed to bother other people more than it ever bothered me. It didn't, I used to, I get ups. The only time I'd get annoyed is when I would get, Chuck Dodd or Chris Todd or,
Oh yeah, right.
there was a time I'd get the Chuck Robb,
Hmm.
that
Yes.
but that would annoy me a little bit, but it never bothered me, but it's so funny how often the Todd thing happened, but that is something I grew up with. And all the Todd,
Yeah.
when you grow up with two first names, I mean, I used to joke NBC, we were the home of two first names, Brian Williams, Andrea Mitchell, Chris Matthews, David Gregory, Chuck Todd. It was sort of astonishing how many of it. You're like,
Joy
yeah,
Reid,
it's,
yes,
every,
exactly.
it was like, how
That's why
many
they
of us
hired
had?
Jen Psaki. There are no
Yeah,
Psaki
there was like, there's no Saki
McMillans
first
out there.
names, right? Yeah, no Maddow's out there anymore, or
Yes. I
whatever.
once did a story on the Senate. First of all, there's a good statistic how many Americans have two first names. And senators have double the rate of two first names in
Interesting.
the
So I went into the
population.
wrong business. I could have,
Yeah.
I had a shot at this if I wanted to be a U.S.
And then
senator.
you could be a senator and get on a Sunday show
Yeah.
and call someone by their last name. Yeah.
So let me to go back to the timing issue of your podcast. What's a story that I would think belongs in your podcast that you don't do because of timing or because of topic? What's something that doesn't make the cut that might surprise people?
Well, how I describe it to people is ideally it's an op-ed of the air. And okay, that's me using these antiquated terms. We were just done talking about them.
Talking about it,
even
right?
understands what an op-ed is. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is a good gist discussion is subtly a debate. It's always a debate.
Mhm.
And I'm not taking the other side of the debate. I'm not a partisan, but I want them to explain not just there are great interviews that the question to be asked and answered is, and then what happened or what happened next?
Oh,
That's a great interview. It's not a great gist interview. A great gist interview is
yeah,
why,
Larry
what
King,
about
the great
this?
Larry King
What about
interviews
that?
were that. Yeah, those were Larry
Yeah.
King and Charlie Rose. I always thought were underrated interviewers because they were so good at just sometimes saying, and then what?
Mhm. And why is still the best question. But if it's we don't do a lot of history unless there's an angle to it, bringing it up to the present, or let's re-examine why people thought that. But I would love to if I had a show that wasn't the gist. I do a ton of history, and when we do history podcasts or history interviews, people love them. But I do think it's because I'm engaged in a little bit of a debate.
What's if you had more bandwidth, what would you be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have two shows besides this one, but they're sort of shows within a show. And one is called Funny You Should Mention. It's where I interview comedians sort of about their theses, comedians being the new philosophers, and we defer to
New
them not just for
philosophers.
punchlines, but insights.
It's been that way for decades. I mean, I've always thought
Yes.
stand-up comedians were always the most well-read people you'd ever meet. They read more than most.
Yeah, and a lot of times not formally educated, and they felt bad about that, and then they became autodidacts. They're great. I love them. I love the way they think. But I think since definitely pre George Carlin and Richard Pryor, no one was looking to comedians for insight, and then were the niche. And then there was Mort Saul, who would read a newspaper on stage. I don't know how funny it was, and then Lenny Bruce, and this all changed. But I do think there was a story in the either late night, it must have been the aughts, where it just quoted Chris Rock as an expert on the Black experience, and maybe said comedian Chris Rock, but he was there for his insight. And that's when I said, okay, they're pundits now, they're pundits with punchlines. So that's one of the shows I do. And another one,
have you ever done it? Have you ever done stand-up comedian?
When I was in college, I did.
Yeah.
And so my kids do it. And the reason that I'm not good at it could be many things, right? But the big one is a stand-up comedian will do when you see his act. It's like, oh my God, what fresh insights. But of course, they'd have done this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So I'd rather do a show every day and have a couple of hits and say to myself, if I had more time to work that over, it could be fantastic. It could be an A+, but I'd rather have a string of, let's hope, A minuses. This is also one of my problems with when I worked for NPR. I did mostly sports, and I would crank out a lot of stories because when you cover the World Series, you do 2 stories every day, and then you cover the Super Bowl. And that's great. I love the pace of that. But there was a certain kind of NPR reporter, as epitomized by This American Life or Serial, where, man, did they love going over their tape and with a lapidary fineness, bringing out that one cut of sound. Some of my best friends are great at this. I had no patience for that. So this was the problem with stand-up. You really have to work it over and over and over again.
You don't want to be a refiner. You're like sort of an entrepreneur. You want to break the mold. quickly type of thing.
Yeah. Adam Carolla has this great analogy where he says we're either a factory or a warehouse, right? And the factory is putting out content, and the warehouse is storing it and maybe crafting it. So he sees himself more of a factory. A stand-up comedian is more of a warehouse. I'd say maybe a curator if they're really good.
All right, so you do that. And what was the
And
other
the other
the other
show,
show within a show?
yeah, it's called Not Even Mad. And there's an interesting backstory there. So I would always listen. I do always listen to all these podcasts, and the standard form, if it's not two people being interviewed, three guys talking, not always guys, that's changed a little bit, but let's call it three guys talking and agreeing with each other, right? It's three guys from the Bulwark, or three guys from the Dispatch, or three guys from Commentary, and three guys from Pod Save America. And I listen to all these shows, and I can't tell you how many times I've listened to
I
an
assume
interview.
you listen to it in sped up, 1.5 speed.
Yeah, two and a half, 2.3.
2.5. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my app of choice also cuts out silences. We could listen, by the way, much faster than we do. So yes. So maybe you've had this thought also. I listen to the three people at the Commentary podcast talking about whatever they're talking about, and John Podhoretz makes a good point. And then I listen to the three guys at Pod Save America talk about what they are talking about, and luckily it's another John. John Lovett or John Favreau makes a good point. But Favreau and Lovett are always agreeing with each other, and Podhoretz and his guys are always agreeing. What if we took a Lovett and put him next to a Podhoretz? So this was my idea, right? This is my idea to have a liberal and a conservative talk. And the first iteration of it didn't really work because of, well, it was called Not Even Mad, but there was a little bit of madness. Right. And so now, I do think that for these shows to have a lot of traction, you get to know the hosts and the panelists, and that would be ideal. But I'm just changing panelists every week. And it's
boy, it's a tough.
Right.
I'm rooting for you on that, but the algorithms really fight you on that. It really is hard. I mean, look, I'm watching this myself, right? I'm trying to build a specific. I do not want to pick a side, right? Megyn Kelly made a decision, and she built a big audience quickly. That's one way to do it. I kind of want to, I sort of believe in I want to get it. I'm going to do it my way, and hopefully it'll be a more durable audience. It's actually what worked for me on Twitter versus the way others did it. And so I'm mindful of that, but, the distribution models don't reward left, right. It's hard to find an audience that says they want that. And I don't know whether that's the algorithms speaking or whether that's reality.
I do think it's mostly reality. I think the algorithms figured out what works because the audience told them. And I think that there's a niche for it, but it is a niche. And I hope you come to dominate the niche. And I've got my little toehold in the
niche.
Right. And really,
it's all niches. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
It's a series of them.
I think it's mostly like when you listen to a radio station. Remember, kids, there was a thing called radio. There's no radio station that plays a little country, a little hip hop, and a little classic rock. You have to have a format. And the format of podcasts is, this is a conservative podcast. This is a liberal podcast. The exception are the ones that are neither liberal or conservative, but are actually more radical than either. Maybe not consistently left and right, but I think, Sargar and Breaking Points, Crystal Ball, that's in that category. Maybe I guess you could dub them, far left, but so far left that there's a lot of right to them, but they also have a consistent format.
Well, look, I think I don't want to do too much more on sort of the business of what we're doing, but it does feel like you have such a knowledge of this, and you've been, are you one of those folks? Do you think, is there more change in the next 5 years or less of it? We're all preparing for radical transformation, and usually sometimes if everybody's betting on that, it sometimes doesn't become self-fulfilling.
Right. In terms of media, in terms of politics, in terms of what? Media?
More media, in terms of media.
I would expect there to be a lot of change. I would expect AI to change things greatly. We got into this place where there used to be a lot of inefficiencies. And now there's a war on inefficiency, and it's working. But, inefficiency in many systems is a really good thing. Like in the animal kingdom, inefficiency is a mutt. And mutts are the healthiest dogs.
That's right. And it's funny you say that. You know why our voting system is so secure? Because it's inefficient,
Yeah.
because it's methodical, because there's these paper ballots that have to follow this. And if it is actually something that's completely inefficient, but if you made it efficient, you'd actually send a message of lack of confidence in the system. We wouldn't trust it.
I'm going to give you one right in your
makes it more trustworthy.
I'll tell you one right in your wheelhouse. So I'm probably telling you something you know, but 80 years ago, the political science movement du jour, started by and led by A.A. Schneider, was we have these political parties and they're inefficient. It really got the political scientists upset. The parties need to sort according to ideology. It doesn't make sense to have all these conservatives in the Democratic Party. Then that happened, not because the political scientists said it, but this is what the political scientists wanted. And it was a total be careful what you wish for.
Oh, yes. I talk about this all the time.
Efficient sorting. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. The lack of ideological diversity inside the two parties. I mean, you and I grew up with liberal Republicans working with conservative Democrats, with the populist Democrats of the Midwest working with the libertarian Republicans.
Moving from when FDR had to work it out with Theodore Bilbo and the very conservative Democrats.
But I grew up with basically a conservative Democrat who left the party and would say, well, Sam Nunn would be a Republican in New York, he would always say that. Like, that's why because I'd always say, Dad, I thought you were Republican. He said, well, Sam Nunn would be a Republican if he were in Iowa, or to be a Republican. He's just a Democrat in the South because you have to be in order to vote, right? Because at the time there weren't many registered Republicans. So it is, but you're right. I think that lack of ideological, the conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans are extinct. And that's what we miss.
Yes.
I think that's what our system
is. I was just in Seattle, and I was spending some time with a very top political consultant, and because he makes a living, he's a Democrat. I don't have to say he's a Democrat in Seattle, but he bemoans the fact that the Republican Party is pretty much non-existent, and all they could do is run some protest candidates who are way out there ideologically and never have a chance for winning. This is another pretty bad aspect of
monopolies are bad for economies. Duopolies are not great for economies, but monopolies are worse. And the political economy that has become a monopoly in rural America for red and a monopoly in urban America for blue has been bad for the voters. It's just been bad. It's been bad for diversity of thought. It's been bad for new ideas, and that's a problem.
And your other business, or your main business, which is media, has been waylaid by efficiency, because a newspaper used to have all these advertisements. And the point is, you knew you were throwing away 90% of your advertising dollar, and everyone who took out a want ad knew that 99.9% of the people weren't in the market for a boat. So it's this inefficient way of hitting a lot of people. Right. Then when the internet, and especially the Google algorithm, got really efficient, great for advertising, pointless for newspapers. They were left with maybe cars in supermarkets, and not even that, because you're only in the mood to buy a car once every 7 years. So efficiency. So to go back to your answer, we're going to get more efficient. There's no way that the media ecosystem is not going to get more efficient. And from what I see, efficiency more often has costs than benefits, except for the very specific person who is served by the efficiency.
All right. I got to ask about the comic books, because if you look carefully behind me, the Roy Campanella is actually a portrait of one of his baseball cards. From Topps in the early 50s. I'm a baseball card guy. Are you a comic guy?
I'm probably more of a baseball card guy, but you know what I am? I just moved my parents out of the house that not only they lived in for 50 years, that I was literally born in the driveway of. And so now I have all these baseball cards and comic books that I got to sell because I have no room. So when you have no room for something, you put a Howard the Duck comic on the wall. I do like Howard the Duck.
Nice, nice. Well,
I
it's
worked in I worked in a baseball card store. That was my first job, and it was the era of I guess I learned about Bitcoin then because Kevin Seitzer rookies were selling for like $70. If you remember
well, it's
that
funny
era.
I'm so glad you referred to it as Bitcoin, because that's been my analogy is, tell me how it's not like, I have a stack of Mike Trout rookie cards.
Ooh,
Um, can I buy something with them directly? No, I've got to trade it in for cash and then I can spend. What's the difference between my Mike Trout baseball card and Bitcoin? And when you throw that out there at a crypto person, and it's like, it's probably the same thing.
yeah. And then if you get into blockchain, I don't know, Ray Fosse blocking the plate chain. I don't know what our analogy could be. But
Well, the
yeah, I remember I was listening on NPR, and in the beginning of the Ukraine war, there was a
Mhm.
story about how it's funded via Bitcoin. And isn't it great that Bitcoin can get this money to the Ukrainian
Mhm.
fighters? I'm like, that seems much less efficient than a bank account. Like, I understand you have this interesting thing in the news called
Yeah,
the war on Ukraine, and then you have this
right.
thing called Bitcoin. I think there are more layers in between than a just bank account that works.
Look, I accept the premise it's a little bit easier to hide money, and when you're funding a war and an insurgency, you need to hide stuff. Okay, I get that. The blot, maybe that's the what's helpful in a moment, but most of the time, if you're something that is able to hide transactions or money, that's usually not a net positive for society. That's usually a net
Yeah,
negative.
that is true. I mean, my suspicion is mostly, and by the way, I've lost out on a lot of money because of my suspicion, but there are two things that these cryptocurrencies are supposed to do, and they're at
Mhm.
exact odds with each other, right?
Mm.
This is almost like Donald Trump. The great thing about tariffs is that they will both give us money in the treasury and
Yeah,
suppress trade. No, they can't do both. But
right.
the one thing they're supposed to do is be a great store of value. I get the intellectual case for that. But the other thing why everyone loves them is they're going up to the moon. Now, nothing that doubles or triples in value is a great store of value if it's also being traded as the priciest commodity ever made. So that
Yeah,
that's
no, I
the
mean,
odds.
like I remember as a kid growing up when I think the Hunt brothers tried to corner the silver market, thinking it was an underutilized commodity, and this just feels like it's going to end badly. And the question is, how many Americans are going to get stuck holding the crypto bag when this
Yeah.
happens? Because we know the super wealthy are going to are not going to be the ones holding the bag. It's going to be the everyday people,
Yeah.
just
You
like with
know,
the crazy housing with
so
the
there's an
with
example. Would you say that in that way when your first name was Meat?
That's interesting. So I feel like no, because I would be then I would be blamed for, some other entity's inability to book so and so, or I came
Yeah.
across
Oh, that's the
hostile, like,
consideration. Yeah.
and so you worry about that, and it's like I will just say I would sometimes speak out on some things, and then someone would say, "Hey, we're trying to book so and so, you know, try not to do that again," type of mindset. And it's like, look, I'm a team player, and I get it. And
Right. Right.
look, this balance between, I'm always careful. I don't respect access only journalists, but I respect the need for access. Right? There's a fine line between that, and I think a good journalist draws a distinction. But sort of I kind of view it similarly on that. So I understand it from that, but I certainly feel better about not asking permission.
Right.
And
So
I
this
know,
is
so for instance, like I've been very straightforward, but I've been tough on the Bidens for a couple of years, and they wouldn't return any of my calls. Well, I understood that. Like I made it's like, and that's okay. They don't have credibility with me, so why would I want to interview them anyway? So I'm
right.
okay with that. And I think that's sort of that's that if you're going to burn something, you better feel comfortable burning it.
Yeah. As an example, I don't know if they're the best example of someone who will punish a journalist for not doing the story they want because they were in the mode of we only want to talk to one or two people. They were very much in the mode of our theory of the case is to do almost no interviews. And when
Mm,
we do,
right,
maybe do it on Morning Joe. I
right.
think your listeners to the Chuck Toddcast get this, but what maybe people don't when they criticize you for being or when they question your partisanship and are you able
Right.
to be partisan? You and I have opinions and strong opinions, but you know what? Wake us up in the middle of the night. I think this is true for you. I know it's true for me.
Yeah,
The thing I won't be shouting is, you got to vote for this guy.
I
That's
never
not
will.
where my strong opinions lie. It's more like looking at a system, and we're being crazy when it comes to whatever it is, MMT or
Right.
funding,
Well,
funding
look,
this
I
rebel
look my
group or that.
rant this look my the current podcast that I have up. One of them, my rant this morning was, you know, was how poorly Trump and Musk executed Doge. But the idea was a
Yep.
really good one. And there was a better way to do this. And sort of like it actually was empowering because I realized this is what you do, I think, extraordinarily well, and what I hope to do better, which is explain why. Look, this is the criticism is in execution. The criticism isn't in ideology. And
Right.
and so my biggest criticisms of Trump are execution. This is just a terribly incompetent administration in just doing the basics. Um, doesn't mean his ideas. I'd like to see more manufacturing back in America. There is a systematic way. I had Orrin Cass on the way he would have implemented this tariff regimen might have had a better shot at triggering better trade deals and not shaking up the markets. But that's not the way Donald Trump did it. He did it in an incompetent way. Making government more efficient and more modern. We need to update the infrastructure of government the same way you can't have the same bridge that you're going over from the 1950s with today's traffic patterns. It's the same thing with various government agencies. But Doge was a poorly executed version of this. And in fact, the dirty little secret is Doge will cost the American taxpayer more money than it saved because of all the lawsuits, all the restoration of benefits, all the restoration
Yeah.
of contracts that got
Well, yeah,
unconstitutionally nixed.
paying people for 90 days not to work and then filling
Right.
them in, and then you
So
pay them
we've
to
just
come back.
cost us.
That's great.
And yet
Yeah.
the irony is you'd have had bipartisan buy-in. There was a whole bunch of Democrats. I mean, this is what frustrates me about the mindset of Trump and MAGA, which is they won. Now we'll never work with the other side. When every other president of my lifetime said, "Hey, the best way for me to be to get something done is to," and it's sort of two motivations. One, I can divide the other party by getting some of them to work with me. And guess what?
Yep.
It helps me in the macro. It's better for the country. Oh, and I divide my opponent. Like you're still, but it's an effective way to still be partisan, but maybe doing it through the prism of the best interest of the country versus Trump, who's refusing to work with Democrats, just fired,
Right.
and you're like, dude, there's a whole bunch of Democrats that want to prove that they do want to work with you. Take advantage of it. And
Well,
your
he's great.
inability
He's
to do it
brilliant
is
at.
on you. And guess what? You're now going to just drive people away. This is why his approval rating's already under 45 is he refuses to be president for all the people. He just does.
His great skill is at diagnosing the problem, and then he
Yes.
has no interest, in fact, a negative interest in actually solving the problem. And I think that
No, he'd
one of the
rather have the
things that makes
problem to use as a
yes,
cudgel. Yeah.
but one of
Sorry.
the things that makes him so good at diagnosing the problem, this is what he's been doing for 50 years as a salesman. Every
Mhm.
innovation is, what problem does it solve? So he'll put his finger on the problem. He'll put it in a more vivid way than anyone else in
Mhm.
politics and have absolutely no interest in solving it. But I do think the knowledge of how hard these problems to solve holds a lot of Democrats and some Republicans back. It would be great to just point your finger to the problem of infrastructure and say, infrastructure, it's the other guy's fault. But no, infrastructure is a giant lift. Once you know that, maybe you don't speak as starkly about it as
Right.
Donald Trump does. So I do think the more you know about the problem, sometimes the more it gets in the way of actually solving it. You know who I did this pretty much the same segment, but I did it in a different way through an interview.
Yeah.
As we're recording, I had Anish Chopra on. He was
Mhm.
the first ever chief technology officer of the United States. And
Right.
he essentially ran the office that became DOGE. And we just talked about, so tell me, he didn't do it in the style that you did. I understand Elon had a hat and a chainsaw and you wore a suit, but what were the things that he did that you liked? And we
Right.
had a very good conversation. It was very constructive. He talked about a lot of the things that he admired that
Right.
Doge actually did. He made a couple of points, one explicitly and one by inference. The point he made explicitly is he could have come up with more savings if he was, or that office was, as prioritized by the Obama
Obama, yeah.
administration as DOGE was, right? So
Right.
presidential bandwidth and mental time,
Always.
that counts for a lot. And so
Yeah.
Obama was doing other things, and he wanted this as a backstop. He'd never be able to achieve the actual cuts, not even the minuses that Elon did. But also, as I was talking to him, I just said to myself, yes, you know what you are? You're reasonable. You look at the net benefits, right? You definitely don't have a chainsaw and a hat. And that alone is not holding you back. But the way that Anish Chopra would have done it, he could have gotten billions more in savings, and we would have known a billionth of what he did. There was
That's
no
so
PR
true.
aspect. It's almost negative PR. Yeah.
Well, that goes back to, it's amazing to me how many people don't learn the lesson from Trump. I mean, have you noticed, like, what to me, like, the brilliance of Trump 2015 was he'd go anywhere. He would interview with anybody. He didn't care. And he sat down with everybody. I've not seen a Democrat implement that same strategy. Not once. And you're like, that guy
Buttigieg comes
just,
close, right?
he
When
comes
Buttigieg
close.
ran, he was,
And
yeah,
by the way, who got traction out of nowhere?
yeah.
Buttigieg, right? Why? Because he was showing up everywhere, right? He was willing to show up everywhere. So it is weird to me how long it's taken. There's such this anger, it's funny. It's like, there is people on the left who view Trump the same way as society views Hitler. And I know that the minute I bring up the H word, like, people start tuning out. But the point is that, there is no praising any idea Hitler ever had, because it was all in service to something grotesque, right?
Right.
The Democrats, I think, sometimes too often look at Trump and saying, if he's for it, we have to be against it, because his ends, everything he does is, and you're just sitting there going, there's ways to learn from him without emulating him. And I don't,
Yeah.
it is, and I don't know why. I don't know whether we blame internet culture for this, right? Where too many of politicians today are so responsive to the moment that they actually can't take a step back and see the big picture. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer as to why Democrats have had such a hard time learning what has made Trump work. There's some parts of this that work, and they ought to learn.
I think Democrats, especially when they were ascendant, their skill set, what success in the party selected for, was the ability to relentlessly stay on message and not make a mistake. And this was what Obama was great at. And you could see that this was what Kamala Harris, this was her theory, even if she didn't articulate it, is how she operated. Trump's the opposite. Mistakes don't matter. Mistakes probably help him. And there is no message. But I do think, because of our fractured media society, and because of podcasting and long form podcasting, and the fact that an audio interview could go an hour and a half, I think that old Obama way of don't make a mistake and get your three message points of the day out, I think that's done. And I don't know that the Democrats have realized that. The other thing is the things that Trump does well. We were just talking about DOGE. And, Democrats, you said Democrats would love to cut. Would they? I think probably in their heart of hearts, a few would, maybe many would. But in terms of the salience of the issue, it's not 1, 2, or
Maybe
3.
you're right.
And
I mean, I may be
here's
thinking
another.
about a
I
Democratic
just want
Party
to
from
mention
10 years ago,
one.
and that maybe that one doesn't exist, because not every answer is government, but I do think a growing number of Democratic office holders believe that it is.
Well, one thing that I support Trump on is the elimination of pennies. And I've been talking about this on my show for 5, 10 years. And every time a presidential candidate or a senator or anyone else would come through, I would ask them, why do we still make the penny? What do you think about the elimination of pennies? And I asked many senators about this. I asked Michael Bennett. I asked Pete Buttigieg. And every single one of them was interested in the idea, but they were all hesitant to just sign on to the obvious. They all claim they hadn't thought of it before, and I believe them. They were all unbelievably cautious in embracing the riskiness of eliminating the penny. And Donald Trump, sure, he gets himself in trouble with much more consequential items like, maybe we should arrest doctors if they give an abortion. But he definitely would have said, oh, yeah, penny's stupid.
No.
And that's the right answer.
By the way, look, do you think Kamala Harris would be negotiating with Iran right now?
No. I do
I
not.
mean, so I sit there and it's like, now, am I troubled that what's motivating Trump to do this is his business deals with the golf guys? Yeah, I'm troubled by the motivation of it. But at the same time, sometimes you need some pragmatism, has to be the coin of the realm in the Middle East, or you're not going to have any stability in the Middle East. And I say stability, not peace.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
actually think there's a difference. And so, these are the things that the left needs to realize, why the public is more tolerant of Trump than they are. Because on some of these things, Trump's behaving no different than what I think they think anybody in that position should be behaving, which is, hey, sometimes you got to make deals with people you don't like. And that
Right.
there's no, that's realpolitik. So it is interesting to me how, and I think what's going to be interesting is that if Democrats do win the presidency in 28, my assumption, it's because somebody has learned those lessons. If they have a nominee that hasn't learned those lessons, they're not going to win in 28.
Oh, will have to be. Have to be.
Yeah.
And I think everyone who's running is positioning themselves as the guy who's learned the
Yeah.
lessons. And I think they all have a different version of it, right? Gavin Newsom is, I talked to Michael Savage and contradicted, 12 years
Yeah.
of my record. And I
Yeah.
think Tim Walz is, I'm that regular guy who code talks. And like
Yeah.
that comes
Yeah.
off as a little clunky.
I
Yeah.
think if you're caught trying too hard, you're just that trying too hard. Let me close out with this, since you're a recovering sports reporter. And
Mm-hmm.
I spent a brief period. I helped found a sports business publication back in the early 90s. So I guess I can claim some stint in the sports reporting world. I do view sports as sort of the last bastion of our culture that can bring us together. Like, I have this thesis that that I can make youth sports and high school sports the revenue stream that classified advertising was to support local news, that in the long term that could be. I think when you look at, a live event, a sporting event can bring red and blue together better. I mean, the NFL's the king of all of it. And yet coverage of sports is becoming more partisan and more, you're starting to see there's conservative sports guys and there's liberal sports guys. Where's this headed? Is sports going to become as polarizing as politics because of the nature of how independent media works, or will it continue to be the last piece of glue we have in society?
I think sports themselves are going to continue to be the glue. The talking about sports is definitely going to fracture along the lines that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But the sports themselves, take Caitlin Clark. She can be the epitome of everything that a progressive believes in. And she could
Mm-hmm.
also be the epitome of everything that a conservative says is good
Yeah.
about the country, right?
Yeah.
A
She's one of the
progressive could
best. She's
say,
my favorite Rorschach test in America these days, right? Like,
yeah,
I can
this
learn
is
a
a
lot about
woman
somebody
who's
by how they feel about Caitlin Clark.
right. Look at what she's done as a woman. Look at what she's
Yep.
done for women's sports. Look
Totally
at
agree.
how she's unapologetic, or look at how a dad and daughter work together. Look at all the
Right.
hard work. Look at all
Yeah.
the teamwork. So Caitlin's going to be Caitlin, and is when she comes back from her quad injury, is going
Right.
to be converting these 25 footers. She'll be the thing, and then everything around it can talk about her however they
Right.
want.
Right. But it is sort of, I am hopeful that we can stay glue, but we'll see. I am a little concerned that a few sports are, the participants are all lean one way. Like, it's tough to
Mm-hmm.
be a liberal golfer and it's tough to be a
Yes.
conservative NBA player, right?
Well, I know examples of both, and I
Yeah.
think it's much less tough. I can speak. I know that golfers. I think 12 years ago, I read a story that there were no registered Democrats on the tour. But I know that, especially among conservative or people who are not orthodoxly
Mhm.
progressive among the NBA, much easier than it was during the days of the bubble and the
Yeah.
lockdown.
Oh, that's
Much
interesting.
easier.
I find it interesting. Bruce Pearl is fascinating to me because you don't see a lot of college basketball coaches being so political. I think for fear it would harm recruiting, right? Now,
Yeah.
he's political on one story and on one issue, though I notice he's every once in a while he'll just do regular politics, but for the most part he sticks to just Israel. And obviously it hadn't had any impact, right? Auburn's had doing terrific. And in fact, he's turned them more into a basketball school than they've ever been, even in the Charles Barkley days.
Right.
But it is, that stuff fascinates me. And I am very curious, because you also see it, certain in college football, certain coaches, if they're believers on a religious front, almost then do better with other believers, right? And it's almost how they recruit is through
Yes.
that prism. And it is still interesting to me that how much college football does work that way, and people are not quite aware of that.
Right. Bobby Bowden was a great example of that. There are many others, but I do think Bruce Pearl, I think the team responds to it. There's a lot of inspiration there, and he brought this hostage family to the Final
100%.
Four, and they were eventually freed. I also think that Steve Kerr, okay, I know they're professional, but Kerr and Popovich are very vocal. Popovich was on the progressive side, and I think what people respond to, you
Do you
could
think
say
Kerr would be
the
that way in
NBA is more.
Indianapolis versus San Francisco if he were the coach in
I
Indianapolis?
think so, because I think people respond to his conviction, the strength of his conviction. I don't think most of these 20-something-year-olds really have they might have inclinations, but they don't have deep political opinions to begin with. And when they see Kerr as interpersonally, they respect him, and therefore they respect the stances that he takes. He also, it's very important that in all of these cases, no one is taking really outlandish, outre, dangerous. Everyone, you could always criticize everyone in someone's eyes as doing that, but I think they are sticking mostly to, the factual basis of their arguments and doing it with conviction and responsibility overall.
And I think you just said the same. I mean, in some ways, Bruce Pearl and Steve Kerr both have that. They speak with such a conviction on the singular topic, right? Particularly Kerr on gun reform, Pearl on the Israeli hostages. That if if it's deeply held, I think in some ways, even people that don't agree with you will respect it, right? To that form. Let me get you out of here on this, which is an expression Tony Kornheiser uses, and I love it. And it's simply this: what's 3 or 4 things you read every day that that most people would be shocked to know that you read every day, in order to, like, what's your, not to give away any secrets, but you're clearly a pretty well-read in person. You have a diversity of interests. I thought I had a diversity of interests. You're times 1,000. And in fact, I'm very jealous of your newsletter at times, because I'm like, yeah, you literally have, I think, have created a newsletter of just your interests. And you're just like, if you have my interest, then you'll enjoy my newsletter. Period.
This is the newsletter, the Just list, which I probably should have plugged.
Which really is just my stuff, right? It's the Pesca list, right? What's a couple of things you read in on every day that just nourishes you to a point you're like, everybody should be reading this, and I know they don't.
Right. So I will say the New York Times, which won't surprise everyone. The Financial Times is fantastic. I think the financial press overall is, I don't know if it's the last bastion, but they're much more truthful and honest. And
it's the least partisan. It certainly has an ideology.
You
it's
could
pro-market, but it's less.
I don't think
partisan.
they're trying to convince you of anything other than this is really the story. And so Bloomberg and The Economist are things that I'm happy to spend subscription money on. And then I also read the Nikkei reports from Japan, just to get some interesting kind of funny news. I read another newsletter put together by Walt Hickey called Numlock. He's been doing it for so many years. I love that newsletter. I have vowed never to steal an item, but I steal his sources, or I see where he's getting.
And then you're like, I'm going to start reading that source.
Yes, exactly. That's how I got Nikkei. And then I read Eric Zorn, who does a thing called the Picayune Sentinel. He used to be the best columnist of the Chicago Tribune, and the Tribune's been decimated. Zorn is awesome, and especially my sister lives in Chicago. I'm fascinated by Chicago. I have a few.
Zorn's like the last. He was like the replacement for Royko, wasn't he? And he was sort of like the last of his kind.
I think there's like a direct line there. Yes, I think he's in that lineage. Although, I think everyone probably who was a columnist at the Tribune, like John Cass and all these guys were kind of anti-Roykos, would say, I'm the last Royko. And Bob Greene, there was another controversial figure. What a paper. What a paper that is now a husk of itself. And There's a
Yeah.
building in Chicago called the Tribune Building, and I bet people don't even know there's a newspaper associated with it. It's
Yeah,
unbelievable.
some of the papers that didn't survive, I just that one, but there's
I
a
mean,
whole
it's
bunch of
there,
them.
but
Sure, but like Boston Globe's the same
yeah,
way. Like it was, wow,
yeah.
it was like a more of a
And that
national
sports
paper than
section, the
oh
the Globe sports section. Oh my God, everyone. The
no, I
Post
mean,
sports section, the Post style section. There was a
that was a great
compendium
section.
of greatness. Yeah.
And now, boy, the Post both are just, they're not what they used to be. Mike, this was a pleasure. You're like I said, you're a pioneer in this space, and you've you have an originality that you can't it's hard to emulate, and I think that for me feels like the key to your success.
Well, thanks, Todd.
All right, Pesca. Yeah, I use Italian for fish. I mean, is it that simple? You grew up as a fish?
The name of the production company is Peach Fish Productions because Italian pesca is peach, but pesce is fish, so it's peach fish.
Oh, that's funny. I like that. I love a good sort of naming origin that does stuff like that with words and language. That's awesome. Mike, appreciate the time.
Oh, thank you so much.